this week. You said that America has, quote, never been a racist country.
While I would ordinarily look at the phone, that's counterintuitive when I'm on Route 95. Now, Nikki Haley is not her given name. I can't pronounce it. It would be terrible if I tried. Our founding fathers were, in fact, racist men. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, both owned slaves. And the reason that they owned those slaves is because they were black men and women. It had completely nothing else to do but racism. That's what we're talking about. And in 1861, 11 states left our union to form the Confederate States of America. On each one of those very specific constitutions where they broke away from our union, they said that slavery shall be forever. And in 1865, that was then over. However, even though the repugnant racists that owned slaves lost the war, they were able to repress Americans that happened to be African American from 1865 until today. From 1865 to 1867, there was normal control of the South by Southern governments. In 1867, radical Reconstruction occurred where the U.S. federal government divided the South into military districts and began to rebuild because the South had been destroyed during the Civil War, especially by people like Grant and Sherman. In 1877, Reconstruction ended, and there went all of the achievements African Americans had achieved up to that time. There had been black members of Congress, not anymore from the South. Jim Crow was instituted. We cannot guess the number of African Americans that were killed under Jim Crow laws, which, by the way, still existed and were basically enforced in parts of the South until the 1980s. My friend Nick, who is 28, was not aware that racism existed at this time. And I say to everyone listening, from 1865 until 1928, Woodrow Wilson is the shining example of Democratic leadership in the White House. The rest of those who were in charge were Republicans who had a very laissez-faire, which means hands-off, on how business ran the country, which is why you have the Gilded Ages and the rising of Rockefeller and Carnegie and Mellon. And the Republican Party at that point, which had gotten rid of slavery, endorsed big business and suppressed voters who were in unions. And the reason why we have Labor Day is because the amount of people that died between 1870 and 1910 to get rid of child labor, which, by the way, the state of Florida is trying to bring back, and Iowa has brought back, and Arkansas has brought back, because Republicans can't govern. But that's a different story. Racism. In World War I, African Americans were not allowed to serve in combat. In World War II, they were allowed to serve in limited roles. The 465 combat team that was in Normandy under the 3rd Army under George Patton, I think it's 385th, I can't remember, I'm driving. They were a tank destroyer battalion, entirely black-led. Got combat stars from George Patton, happy to have them in the military. 1947, the color barrier is broken by Jackie Robinson for the New York Dodgers. 1948, Truman, a Democratic president, desegregates the military. In 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education to end separate but equal schools, which, by the way, was racist. At the same time, we had racist policies in immigration. We had a Chinese and Japanese exclusionary acts between 1865 and 1945. We had the people that were controlling Congress were Protestant, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's where we get the word WASP from. They didn't want Catholics and Jews coming from Europe. So countries in Eastern Europe had less immigration than countries in Western Europe, and they deemed Italy to be in Eastern Europe. Racism is a great thing, right? Then, 1954, I said Brown versus the Board of Education. Then you have the Selma bus strike, which is successful, beginning to break down Jim Crow. In 1958, Dwight David Eisenhower rolls the National Guard into Little Rock, Arkansas to forcibly, by gun, desegregate the racist, repugnant people of the South. Gee, I wonder if there's any racism. 1960, you have the Greensboro Four, where a group of men that, and by men, they were in their 20s, who sat at Woolworths in the area that they were not allowed to sit in because of racism. And then you had how many different peaceful marches by Dr. King and everyone else. And those marches were assaulted on by cops with German Shepherds. And one of the things that helped drive the civil rights movement to success was television, because people got to see man's inhumanity to man, and especially the women and children who were marching peacefully getting attacked by dogs and cops. And then in rapid succession, we have JFK is elected. He works with Martin Luther King. We get the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. In 1968, MLK is killed. RFK is killed in the summer of 1968, and we get Dick Nixon and his Southern strategy. The Southern strategy was to get rid of Democrats that had been aligned historically in the South with the Democratic Party, which had changed. LBJ had brought in Medicaid and signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which upsetted the racists. Shocker! Dick Nixon had a Republican strategy to get those voters who were racist and white, and that's what the Republican Party has done. And in 1974, the last vestiges of pre-Brown versus the Board of Ed was taken care of by the Supreme Court to make sure that all schools would be desegregated, which upset the Jerry Falwells of the world, who liked having white-only Christian schools. Because, you know, Jesus wasn't a black man who lived in Jerusalem. The repugnance of this woman to say there is no racism in our country is mind-boggling. Don't even get me started on crack and taking money away from children in poor areas due to testing under the 80s, 90s, and 2000s under Republican leadership. Racism exists. If we don't talk about it honestly, it will persist. Vote true and vote blue.